teil on vaja seda alguses ülikooli mikrofoni.
No. Okay. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Lauri Melksoo, and I'm director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, which is a think tank based in Tallinn. And our today's topic is self-determination processes in the EU, the Catalan case implications for the EU. About one year ago, the editor-in-chief of the European Journal of International Law, Joseph Weiler, brought this topic up in the editorial of his journal, basically making the case that if Catalonia wants to become, let's say, an independent state, it can, it has the right to, but then it has serious implications for the EU, and in fact it has to specifically negotiate access to the European Union. I conclude from that this is quite an important topic. If the main journal of European international lawyers, discusses this at length at its editorial, I also have to say that this in social media it became a little bit controversial. Should international lawyers involve in politics like this? And his argument was interpreted as obviously taking the pro-sovereignty side, because the message was that if Catalonia wants to go separate, then it cannot just presume that everything continues in the EU in the same way. And from our side, from Estonian Foreign Policy Institute side, we don't want to, by co-organizing this event, we don't want to send any specific political message or in that sense choose side in any strong way. However, we believe in the value of information, learning, and discussion. We want to basically learn ourselves more, and we are very thankful in that sense for you for this opportunity. Now, before I give the floor to Albert, how do you pronounce your family name? Royo, who is Secretary General of Public Diplomacy Council of Catalonia, I will very briefly sketch sort of Estonia's history in terms of self-determination. And I think one reason why it is fascinating to talk about self-determination in today's Europe, in today's EU, is because in some ways Estonia's fate, if you want, has been so closely connected with the notion of self-determination. Estonians celebrate the 2 February 1920 peace treaty between Soviet Russia and the Republic of Estonia as a sort of birth certificate of our statehood. And it is a very important treaty also, not just for Estonia, but for the history of international law, because I believe this was the first time that separation was recognized by a former motherland based on the principle of self-determination. So it says in Article 2 of Tartu Peace Treaty that Russia recognizes for all times Estonia's independence based on the principle of national self-determination. That is very important. We in Estonia, we don't usually like communists, but interestingly, this self-determination, as you know, was quite big in Lenin's agenda, and the same phrase of the importance of self-determination was also included in other treaties with Lithuania and Latvia and Finland, I believe, in almost identical way. Another thing is what of course, the Bolsheviks really thought about this. There is some evidence that this was seen as a kind of tactical piece. In any case, in the end of 80s then, when Estonia struggled for the restoration of independence, we kind of didn't anymore have to rely on the argument of self-determination for achieving or restoring statehood, or didn't have to rely so much, because we to some extent relied on a stronger argument, which was the state continuity, right? The argument of self-determination was already made in 1918, 1920. But I also want to say that Estonia's independence was not a gift by the Bolsheviks, but this treaty was, of course, preceded by the War of Independence. To our foreign guests, if you go to the Freedom Square here, then there is a memorial to this War of Independence of ours. And it's quite interesting. For example, our politicians, our thinkers in exile, they had arguments about this. What arguments should Estonia use? And then some people said that, well, in the 60s, you know, self-determination became big and on a global agenda. And some people said that, well, let's also use more this argument of self-determination. But then it also became clear that of course the old European, old world powers, they prefer to restrict self-determination more to these, let's say, colonial contexts. And the Soviet Union kind of never admitted that the Russian Empire had colonial traits. So, and I think in Estonia we are aware of how complex and sometimes complicated this whole issue of self-determination is. Think of Kosovo. On the one hand, so the whole story with the unilateral declaration of independence, and there was a case in the International Court of Justice where the judges were asked whether it corresponded to international law or not, and Estonia, our foreign ministry sent a brief to that case, kind of being very enthusiastic about the right of peoples to self-determination, and saying that Kosovo people also have that. But always the claims for self-determination, there are paradoxes in it, because while we did send that to in support of Kosovo, Madrid, for example, didn't, obviously. And then the EU nations are actually split in terms of who recognizes Kosovo as state and who doesn't. Spain and Romania, for example, haven't recognized Kosovo as state. At the same time, if you would ask Estonians, you know, let's really figure out whether we could also take pieces of Estonia and create some sort of separate units, I don't think that we would be very happy about that. And the problem with self-determination claims is that it is on the one hand necessary to be somehow consequential, but it can be sometimes very difficult. And in international law too, my colleague there at Tartu faculty, Rene Värk, will talk more about this later. It has been the 20th century history of self-determination claims in international law. It's kind of a mess sometimes. But enough of me, Albert, your message.
Okay, thank you so much. Tere hommikut, tori on oia Tallinnas, ma sovin eriti tänada meie Eesti sopru, toetuse eest Kataloonia teemalise konverentsi organiseerimisel. Suur tänu teile. Sorry about that. That's all my non-existent Estonian. I would like to start by thanking to the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, especially to his director, Professor Lauri Melkso. Also special thanks to our friend, its Deputy Director, Andres Kasekamp. I'm also very grateful that Professor Kęstutis Girnius came from Lithuania to participate in this event, and also to Professor Alex Calvo, who is currently, in fact, teaching in Japan, and he accepted to participate in this event. Thank you so much, all of you, for attending, and a big hello also to all of you who are following us through live streaming. So, as you know, last year, 2014, that was a key year for freedom of peoples in Western Europe. After the Scottish referendum of independence, which took place in September the 18th, all the eyes turned to Catalonia, which had planned a referendum for independence for November the 9th. It's a happy coincidence that the two biggest EU stateless nations were planning to hold a self-determination vote in the very same year, in 2014. In fact, if we compare the two cases, this can help us to better understand what is happening right now in Catalonia, maybe because the Scottish case is better known internationally. So if we try to compare the two cases, we have some similarities, many similarities in fact, and some differences. If we start with the similarities in terms of population, we are talking about a population of 5 million inhabitants in the case of Scotland, 7.5 million inhabitants in the case of Catalonia. Both territories are placed within the European Union. Both nations lost their sovereignty in the beginning of the 18th century. In the case of Scotland, because Scotland decided to join the Union with England in 1707. In the case of Catalonia, we lost our sovereignty because we were defeated in the Spanish Succession War before the French and Castilian troops in 1714. So this is just 7 years after Scotland decided to join the UK. So nowadays, being part of the EU and probably being the most pro-European territories of their respective states, they are wondering, these two territories are wondering whether it would be more effective to have a direct say in Brussels without having to go through Madrid or through London, so as to better represent the interests of their respective populations, respective citizens. As a result of that, probably both are experiencing a self-determination process. The one in Scotland right now is frozen. The one in Catalonia is still going on. But the two processes were based on a civil movement, deeply democratic and peaceful, much more linked to the need to politically empower their citizens and to offer them the right to decide on any relevant issue than to all romantic ideas. If we enter into the differences between the two cases, although it's true that the Catalan movement is maybe more clearly a bottom-up, cross-party, and massive movement, if we compare it to the Scottish one, you just have to remind the big demonstrations which have been taking place in Catalonia in the recent years, I would say that the main difference relates to their respective counterparts. In the case of Scotland, this is the UK, which, as you know, perfectly accepts that Scotland, like Wales or Ireland, they are nations, so they have the right to decide, the right to self-determination. If you go to Westminster and you have the chance to visit the two chambers, in the middle of the two chambers, the chambers of the Lords, chambers of the Commons, you'll see a hall with the frescoes of the four patron saints of the four nations: St. David, St. Andrew, St. Patrick, and St. George. It means that, well, it's clearly accepted by everybody in the UK that the UK is composed of four nations. That's the main reason probably why Scotland was given the opportunity to hold a binding self-determination referendum, like Quebec was given also by Canada some years ago. If we shift to Spain, the contrast is quite clear. The main Spanish political parties and institutions still deny the national nature of Catalonia, not only of Catalonia, but also of the Basque Country, I have to say. Maybe because Catalonia was incorporated to the unitary kingdom of Spain instead of being incorporated to the United Kingdom of Spain. As a result of that, according to the main political parties in Spain, we, Catalans, we don't have the right to decide, so we don't have the right to self-determination. Just a small piece of information, if you read the Spanish Constitution, it is crystal clear. There is only one nation in Spain, which is Spain, and then you have regions and nationalities, but by no means there are other nations. In fact, the Constitutional Court, when it ruled against the Catalan Institute of Autonomy in the year 2010, it decided to delete one sentence which was part of the preamble, so it had no legal consequences, which read that Catalonia is a nation. That had no legal consequences, but even though the Constitutional Court decided to delete that sentence in the Statute of Autonomy, which was passed in the year 2006. Let me now go back to last century so as to better understand what is happening nowadays in Catalonia. You may know that Catalonia was part of the territory controlled by the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War in the 30s of last century. We supported the democratically elected government of the Spanish Republic because we were Democrats and because the Republic had offered a partial autonomy to Catalonia in 1931 for the very first time since 1714. And we as Catalans, we suffered twice Franco's victory in 1939. Why? Because of course we were Democrats, so as a fascist regime was set up, we were suffering because of that, but also because of our national nature. And because of that, our autonomy was annulled, our language was banned for 40 years, and our president, democratically elected president, was arrested in France, where he was exiled, handed over to the Spanish fascists, and shot dead in Barcelona by the fascist regime. And I have to say that although many Catalans, as many Spaniards, joined the French resistance in the 40s and suffered also the Nazi camps, the Allies decided not to free Spain from fascism. So we suffered 40 years of darkness. In the late 70s, in 1977, democracy was restored, and so was a partial autonomy for Catalonia. And I have to say that during the first 25 years of democracy, most Catalan parties decided to prioritize first the consolidation of democracy in Spain, the modernization of Spain in social and economic terms, and the need for reform so as to help Spain join first the European Union and secondly the Euro area. According to this, the main Catalan political parties, this is the center-right Convergència i Unió, which is currently ruling the Catalan government, center-left Socialist Party, which is let's say the Catalan branch of the PSOE, of the Socialist Party in Spain, and even Esquerra Republicana, which is a traditional pro-independence party, the center-left party. They have supported different Spanish governments of different colors, be it the Popular Party, which is rightist party, or the Spanish Socialist Party. So for 25 years, there has been a loyal contribution to Spanish politics from the side of Catalonia. After 25 years, in the year 2005, the main political parties in Catalonia concluded that time had come to try to finally accommodate Catalonia within a diverse and federal Spain. And why? Because democracy was pretty consolidated. There is no risk that we go back to an authoritarian regime, because Spain has become a modern country in economic and social terms, and because the economy was in very good shape in the in 2005 and 2006. So maybe I would say in too good shape, I have to say. Anyway, they thought that that was a very good time to try to pass a new Statute of Autonomy, to try to reform the Statute of Autonomy, which was passed in 1979, so as to, as I said, accommodate Catalonia within this diverse and federal Spain, and also to take into account new realities like the European Union, the immigration from overseas, which was a new reality for Catalonia, internet, and so others. So all these parties decided to follow, of course, the constitutional procedures so as to reform the Statute of Autonomy. According to these procedures, if you want to pass a new regional Statute of Autonomy, it has to be first drafted by the regional parliament, then it goes to the Spanish parliament, it has to be negotiated there, and it has to be passed there by the Spanish parliament, and then the resulting text has to be confirmed by the people of the region concerned, in this case Catalonia, by a referendum. That's exactly what we did. In the year 2005, 90% of the MPs in the regional parliament passed a proposal of new Statute of Autonomy. That text went to Madrid, to the Spanish parliament. That was somehow watered down, that finally got passed in the two chambers of the parliament, of the Spanish parliament, by 2/3 of the two chambers. And that text, even if that had been diluted, that was confirmed by the people of Catalonia in a referendum in the year 2006. So that it came into force in August 2006 once that law, that Spanish law, was signed by the King of Spain. But the problem is that on day one of entering into force, that text was challenged by the Spanish Popular Party, which was then in the opposition. That was already led by Mr. Rajoy, the current Prime Minister of Spain. So that was challenged before the Constitutional Court. And not only this, but the Popular Party started a campaign against that text, gathering some 4 million signatures against that text all throughout Spain. So in a way, leading a huge campaign against Catalonia's autonomy. Well, it was quite surprising to see that the Constitutional Court decided to analyze that case, to study the case, because for the very first time, the Constitutional Court was assessing the constitutionality of an institute of autonomy. Up to then, everybody understood that the regional institutes of autonomy were part of the so-called constitutional bloc. So they are, let's say, the legal consequence, the legal result of a political agreement between the center and a region. So that was quite surprising to see the Constitutional Court was ready to study the case and accepted the case. It took 4 years for the Constitutional Court to rule on the issue. And that was a very aggressive ruling, I have to say, because the Constitutional Court decided to annul or reinterpret, always against the interests of Catalonia's self-government, up to 17 articles of that text. And not only this, but they decided to delete that sentence I mentioned, which read that Catalonia is a nation. That had no legal consequences, but still that was deleted. And that created kind of a clash between legality, which stems from that ruling, and democratic legitimacy, which stems from the fact that that text had been agreed by two parliaments and confirmed by the people of Catalonia in a referendum. And that provoked a huge popular reaction in Catalonia. The first huge demonstration took place in Barcelona just 1 week after the ruling of the Constitutional Court, with 1 million people in the streets of Barcelona, with a clear slogan: we are a nation and we decide. It's not up to a court with 12 judges in a closed room to decide on the political future of Catalonia, but it's up to the people of Catalonia and to the two chambers who accepted and passed that text. Furthermore, 1 year later, in 2011, the Popular Party won the Spanish elections by absolute majority. Mr. Rajoy replaced Mr. Zapatero with a very clear agenda, which was a recentralization agenda. So since then, there have been massive demonstrations in Barcelona or in Catalonia asking for more autonomy, or at least a better preservation of our autonomy. We have had a yearly demonstration in Barcelona since 2010 with between 1 million and 1.5 million people in the streets. It's worth mentioning that in the year 2013, on September 11, which is our National Day, a huge human chain was organized in Catalonia. It was a 400 kilometers long human chain inspired by the Baltic Way, and that's the reason why that was called the Catalan Way. It went from the French border down to the southern limit of Catalonia. And it's quite interesting to see the evolution of the slogans. If in the year 2010, 2011, and maybe 2012, most demonstrators were demanding or using the slogan, "We are a nation, we should be respected." As from the year, especially 2013, in this huge human chain, the slogan changed into a clear pro-independence slogan. That's the reason why politicians in Catalonia understood that something had to be done. So they tried to somehow channel that massive movement through the institutions. That's what democracy is expected to do. So they concluded that we needed a vote, like the vote the Scots were negotiating. Quite interesting to see that the opinion polls in Catalonia, they are quite consolidated since then. between 50 to 55% of Catalans would support the idea of independence, between 30 to 35 would reject this idea. But the most relevant figure is that up to 80% of Catalans want to hold an independence vote. It means that not only those who are in favor of independence, but many who would vote against, still are asking for a proper independence vote. And for me, this is the most relevant figure, because we're talking about democracy. So since that year, since the end of 2012, we've been struggling to convince the Spanish government that we need a vote. We have been asking the Spanish government first to organize a referendum. They rejected. Then we asked them, okay, let's do it the British way. Please temporarily transfer the powers from Madrid to Barcelona so that we can organize this referendum. They rejected. Not only the Popular Party, but even the Socialist Party in Spain rejected this idea. So we plan, okay, we cannot have a proper referendum, binding referendum. Let's have then a popular consultation just to get to know what Catalans want, and then we'll have proper negotiations. That was suspended again by the Constitutional Court, because that was challenged by the Spanish Parliament. So we end up last November by organizing a so-called participatory process, which involved the act of casting a vote. So in the end, there was a vote. And that was quite a successful vote, because the turnout was around 2.5 million people. It's quite similar to the most recent regular, or let's say legal election, which is the European Parliament election, which took place last May. And this is a very good turnout if you take into account all the threats which were made by the Spanish institutions against those who were planning to participate in this participatory process. For instance, against the directors of secondary schools. You have to take into account that elections in Spain are all polling stations in Spain are placed in secondary schools when there are elections. So the Spanish government threatened all the directors of secondary schools that if they wanted to, let the organizers of that participatory process use those schools, they could be suspended. So although there were many threats, 2.5 million people participated, which is, I think, it's a big success. Anyway, regardless of the result, and just for your information, 80% of those who turned out supported the idea of independence. But this is not the most relevant issue. The relevant issue is that 2.5 million people participated. We understand that regardless of that result, that process did not offer us a democratic mandate, because that vote was not recognized by the Spanish institutions, by the Spanish government. It's also interesting to see the reactions that vote provoked in Madrid. For the one hand, we have the judiciary prosecuting the president of Catalonia, Mr. Artur Mas, because he let Catalans express themselves, because he placed ballot boxes so that Catalans could vote. So he's going to be judged, and he could be suspended and even jailed because he just placed ballot boxes. So again, one legalistic, let's say, argument to the Catalan demands for more democracy. A second reaction, just 2 or 3 days after that vote of 9 November, we could hear the head of the Spanish military comparing the situation in Catalonia with that of 1898, when Spain lost the last colonies, Cuba and Philippines. It's quite interesting to see that they do this kind of comparisons between the situation in Catalonia and the colonies of Cuba and the Philippines. And this let me explain that the Spanish Constitution, in fact, foresees that the army is responsible for safeguarding the unity of Spain. I would say this is the only constitution which foresees the possibility that the army can act against its people. And it's important to bear this in mind, because the current Spanish constitution was drafted when the military was, the fascist military was still very powerful in the end of the 70s. You have to remember that there was a putsch in 1981 in Spain, so just to understand how powerful the military was then, and we are still ruled by that constitution. So what may happen in the future? Next steps. We have understood that there is no possibility to convince the Spanish government that we need a proper referendum. That's the way to get to know what Catalans really want for their political future. So there is only one way out. We have concluded that the only way out is to use the regional elections as a de facto referendum. These elections will be called by the president of the Catalan government. He's the only one who can call a regional election. It's going to be an early election which will take place on September the 27th this year. This is a year earlier than expected. And we intend this regional election to be transformed into a de facto independence referendum so that we can obtain a clear democratic mandate, be it that, okay, Catalans are okay with the status quo, or be it that they support the idea that we should be an independent country. Of course, the Spanish government can react. I think it's really difficult that they try to suspend this election because it's going to be a regular election, and if they want to suspend it, according to several legal experts, first they should suspend the Catalan autonomy. That would be a very harsh, let's say, decision which would probably precipitate the conflict. So we don't expect them to do so, but we cannot rule that out. Anyway, I think that things may worsen in the coming months because according to the polls, the Popular Party has very bad electoral expectations for the Spanish elections, which should take place next November, or from next November till sometime from next November till the beginning of next year. And they have been also involved in several corruption cases. So in order to mobilize their electorate, the Popular Party and the Spanish government is getting more and more aggressive vis-à-vis the Catalan movement. So to conclude, we think that there is a European way to tackle territorial conflicts, which is through democracy, through the ballot box, by letting the people concerned decide on their political future. This is the British way, the democratic way. And we think this is a clear message, for instance, to Putin's Russia. In a democratic Europe, we can't accept the use of force to solve non-existent territorial conflicts like in eastern Ukraine. And if there is a conflict, let's use the democratic ways so as to try to solve them. The problem is that Madrid is somehow diminishing this European message, for instance, to Russia, by rejecting the idea that the Catalans can hold a vote like the Scots did last year. And just by denying the reality, just by denying that there is a conflict, a political conflict in Catalonia, by using legalistic arguments and by hiding behind these legalistic arguments, the conflict in Catalonia will not disappear, but on the contrary, it will get bigger and bigger. So we advocate for democracy. We need more democracy. In 21st century Europe, we think that democracy is the way to solve political conflicts. So that's our stance. Thank you so much.
If I may, to respond to you just with one remark, what I found very interesting about the Catalan case or the current situation in Spain is the importance of constitutional law. How basically these claims of self-determination and the struggle for the status of different units, countries, it's never just these are never international legal claims only, but also constitutional law claims, and again making a reference to the Baltic history. Quite interestingly, actually, I mean, Estonia was annexed to the Russian Empire in 1710, and so it's the same time period. And in the end of the 19th century, when Tsar Alexander III starts a sort of Russification campaign in the Baltic provinces here, then the Baltic German elites, they very strongly use the argument that this kind of takeover of the Baltic states took place with a treaty. It was not a capitulation only, but it was a sort of treaty-like capitulation where certain rights were fixated, and indeed some sort of autonomy of use of German language and Lutheran faith were fixated in this. Also, another parallel of a constitutional law. I mean, we have in the hall here a number of people who remember this from the first-hand experience. But in the end of Soviet Union on paper was a very pro self-determination country, and the Soviet republics, according to the Soviet constitution, they were sovereign And then when Gorbachev discovered that actually these nations, they want to now claim their sovereignty, then and this was the main thing over the last years of the Soviet Union, that who gets to vote. Yeah, you can count 2 million people here, or you can count 10 million people here, but based on what do you take those? And then of course the Soviets realized that no one had put it in the law that if you would have then self-determination claim, who gets to decide. And I believe Andres Tarand and Mati Hint and Yuri Adams, and you all remember extremely well how the argument was that no, everybody has to decide that, right? Because why should a person in Gorky or somewhere in give up pieces of part of the Soviet Union? So there are very interesting historical parallels. I believe we will leave also questions to you, but put them in the end of the second panel, so that we can have a wider debate. We can now have a break, a coffee break nearby, and then maybe 20 minutes. So 35 we will continue.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let us continue. This will be the discussion panel where I hope we have a variety of views, a variety of different approaches. We already have different disciplinary backgrounds on the panel, a specialist in international law, a political scientist, a philosopher, all from different countries. And we hope to be able to involve the audience as well, because I'm sure many of you have already come up with questions after the first presentations. Partly we'll be focusing also on issues of security in this panel, and Alex Calvo, who will be first, will perhaps talk more about that, because it's natural that from an Estonian or Baltic point of view, issues which concern us are NATO, not just the EU, and any potential new statehood. That would be a question to be addressed. It was a question which was of interest for us in the debate on the Scottish case, and then we recall that the Scots were less keen on NATO than the English, and that's something that sort of made Estonians worried. So we'd be very interested to hear what the Catalans have to say, not just about the EU, but also NATO, because I would also remind the audience, and people probably know here, that we're also very grateful that Spain at the moment is contributing 4 fighter planes to the Baltic air policing. And at the moment it's Spain's rotation, and Estonians are very grateful for Spain's contribution to our security and defense. So this is some of the issues which I think will come to mind for us as well. But we'll start with Alex Calvo, who's, according to the program, actually representing Japan, because he is, in fact, at the moment visiting professor at Nagoya University in Japan, but he's obviously from Barcelona originally. Like myself, he's also studied in London originally, and he has an interest in security and defense policy, military history, international law, and in fact, his major focus has actually been on the Indian Pacific Ocean area. The idea is that all of the speakers will get about 10 minutes, and then we'll go into a general discussion. Change the order a little bit, because after Alex we'll have our own René Värk from the law faculty at Tartu University, who will talk about the international law dimensions of self-determination. And finally, our guest from Lithuania, Kęstutis Girnius, who's from the Institute of Political Science and International Relations at Vilnius University, but who is originally from the United States, was an undergraduate at Harvard, PhD at the University of Chicago in philosophy. So we will put him as sort of the commentator to the two short presentations, and Dr. Girnius is in my experience, someone who's excellent at raising difficult questions and pointing to contradictions. So I hope that we'll have a lively discussion. So, Dr. Calvo, you're first.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank everybody here and, of course, the Estonian Institute for Foreign Policy for the chance to talk about an aspect of the Catalan movement to recover independence, which, as you rightly said, is very important, I would say, for everybody involved, but even more so in view of current tensions. Maybe some years ago, it would still have been very important, but not as much as it is now. So it is simply to be expected. It is simply legitimate, and it comes as no surprise to find people in Estonia, in the Baltic republics, in the rest of NATO, and in what Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe likes to call the maritime democracies, ask a very basic question, and one which actually Professor Girnius, sorry if I'm not sure whether that's the way to pronounce your name, also posed yesterday, which is to say, okay, let's imagine for a second that Catalonia recovers independence. What are the implications for NATO? Does it mean that NATO as a whole is going to be stronger or weaker? So that's a very important question. Of course, in 10 minutes, I cannot give you a very full answer, but at least I hope I can try to outline some of the thinking about this issue in Catalonia, connecting it also to our past, and in particular to the security policy followed by successive Catalan governments over the last 30 years in this period of limited autonomy. And then, of course, if you have questions or there is some time for discussion later, we'll be more than glad to address them. Now, first of all, the fact that this is very important can be glimpsed simply by something that the Atlantic Council, a US think tank, did in the run-up to the Scottish referendum. They published a short paper comparing the case of Scotland and the case of Catalonia. And actually, following from what Mr. Royo said earlier, I would also like to start my address today by comparing Catalonia and Scotland, looking at the similarities and the differences. And as you will see, in security and defense, the differences are much more important than the similarities. And this is very clear in this report from the Atlantic Council, which I recommend that you read. It's not very long. It's written for busy people, so it's not one of those 100-page reports that nobody reads in full. It's something that you can read on your way to your office. And as the Atlantic Council noted, and you have also mentioned, Scotland within the UK is seen, for good reason, as being softer on defense, as being less committed to security and to collective security in particular, as being a possible weak link in NATO should the referendum last year have gone in a different direction. And the aspect which has attracted the most attention, but not the only one, is this kind of obsession by most Scottish politicians against the British independent nuclear deterrent, which, although British, we should never forget, it also plays a role beyond the UK. And I would dare say that it is a positive factor for the whole of NATO. So any threat against this independent nuclear deterrent and any harm to one of the main pillars of NATO, which is the United Kingdom, is of course going to be seen with at least suspicion by any fellow NATO member state. So it comes as no surprise to remember, and you can check this on Google, the words of President Obama concerning the Scottish referendum, what did Obama say about Scotland? Well, first of all, as a Democrat and as the leader of the free world and the leader of a country which was born precisely out of this principle that you decide what you want to do. Not a few people in a smoke-filled room. Nowadays, no longer a smoke-filled, but that's the old expression. But the people. So, as the leader of this country, of course, Obama supported the referendum, supported the idea that it was up to the Scottish people to decide. But that's not the end of the question, of course, because in addition to being the leader of a free country and of the free world, Obama or any other American president has very grave responsibilities in terms of security and defense. So he also said that he hoped that Scotland would freely choose to remain part of the United Kingdom. And although he didn't elaborate much on this, if you look at his words, I don't remember them exactly word by word, but it's all on the public record, you will see how he referred to the UK's contribution to NATO. Now, in the case of Catalonia and Spain, this is very different. Now, I don't want to sound negative in tone, because that's not my intention at all, but to put it positively, I would say that a lot of people in different NATO countries, and even in Spain itself, even sometimes when you talk to some military officers, some Spanish military officers, who will, of course, not wish to be quoted, but and who may not say it explicitly, but you can see how they would like to live in a kind of more normal country. And what do we understand by normal country? Well, we understand a country which, as you were also saying, sends fighters to the Baltics. So this is fine. This is what Spain, and not just Spain, what other existing and future NATO members must do. And that, of course, goes also for Catalonia. And that's great, and that's what we want to do. We want to be here with the Spanish Air Force and with the Air Force of other NATO countries, side by side, defending the Baltics. This is what is normal. Now, what is abnormal? And not just from a democratic point of view. I'm not going to stress this because it's something that has already been discussed here, but simply from a defense and security point of view. Well, what is not normal is to say, and even to write it into a constitution, which was partly drafted by the military themselves in the late 70s, to say that the role of the military is to keep the country together. Now, setting aside any kind of moral, political, democratic considerations, that's not good for NATO. That's not good for the Baltic states. What the Baltic states need are not 4, 8, 12 Spanish fighters here, or even more. Not those fighters threatening people in order to convince them to stay in a given state. Which, of course, so as you can imagine, it's a bit counterproductive. Because sometimes people who maybe would like to stay, if threatened, then I have a friend who is in this position. He wanted to stay, but now he says he doesn't want to, because he doesn't like to be forced into doing things. But as I said, setting aside any democratic considerations, from a security and defense perspective, what NATO needs is serious countries who have properly trained, properly equipped militaries, and who are committed, seriously committed, to the idea of collective security, which now more than ever is very necessary. Now, another reason why I'm very grateful to be here and to be able to talk about this, again, going back to this comparison between Scotland and Catalonia, is that something which I believe the British must be praised for is that in the run-up to the Scottish referendum, they openly discuss what the implications may be in terms of security and defense. And I'm going to mention, they were not the only ones, but I'm going to mention the case of a think tank in London, which is the Royal United Services Institute. It's one of the oldest think tanks in the world, very prestigious. And I don't really think that the people at this institute are in favor of Scottish independence. Maybe there are a few, but I would say that most of them are against, even strongly against. But they understand that the role of a think tank, just like the role of a university, is not only to talk about what you like or only to defend your own point of view, but is to provide a forum for an exchange of ideas and a forum to examine the different scenarios, the ones that you like and the ones that you don't. So if you visit their website, you will see how they organize, I don't remember the exact number, but at least a couple of seminars on the security and defense implications of the Scottish referendum. Now, this is something that I believe should also be taking place in connection with Catalonia. So I'm very grateful that this is taking place here, but I hope that this is going to be not just a one-off occasion, but that this is going to be repeated in many places, even in Spain itself. Because Spain should also ask itself, setting aside whether they like it or not, that's another question. But they should ask themselves, okay, if Catalonia becomes independent, how is this going to impact Spanish security and defense? So that's something that I wanted to say. Now, this question that Professor Girnius yesterday posed very openly, and I'm grateful for him to put things up front without any kind of, wandering around or wasting time on any secondary issues. I think this is good also when we are a bit short of time. So the question is, okay, let's imagine for a second that Catalonia becomes independent. What are the implications for NATO? I believe that in order to look at this, we have to look at capabilities and commitments, both by the new state, actually quite old, but reborn state, and by Spain proper, Spain without Catalonia. Now, it is legitimate, of course, and I can understand it perfectly, to fear that Spain without 20% of her economy, without more than, according to different estimates, more than 15 billion euro in net tax proceeds from Catalonia, may be able to make a weaker contribution. So some people may fear, well, now we have 4 Spanish warplanes here in the Baltics, that's good. What if they can only afford 2 after they lose Catalonia, or even none of them? So that could be a reason for the Baltic states to refuse to recognize Catalonia. We have to be open about it. But I believe, and I hope, not now because we don't have enough time, of course, but as this debate gradually takes place and we have the time to look at it in detail, that you will come to the conclusion that actually NATO and the security of the Baltic states will not only not be harmed by this development, but actually improve. It is true, of course, that Spain without Catalonia is going to have fewer resources. But I don't really think, if you talk to people at NATO, that their complaint about Spain is capabilities. Yes, of course, everybody would like to have more harbor and more planes and ships and everything. But I don't really think that's the main problem. And also, if you talk to the Spaniards themselves and to people in the Spanish military, I think that the problem, which is, of course, common to other countries as well. So I don't want to be unfair and look as if I'm singling out Spain. But I would say that Spain is one of those countries, not the only one, but one of those which have bought military harbor, sometimes because of international commitments, because of political deals, that later have been unable to properly maintain and to properly involve in exercises. So when you look at their capabilities on paper, when you look at their order of battle, and then compare it to what they can actually deploy, you see that there is a big gap. And here, I would say that also thanks to this experience, when people in Catalonia have begun to think about what our military is going to look like, how it's going to be rebuilt, how we are going to comply with our commitments towards NATO, towards the allies. I would say, and I've talked to some of the people involved, that we are being very careful to avoid this. So the idea is it's better to have 25 fighters, but be able to deploy them all at once, rather than have 50, but find that maybe 30 are grounded because of whatever, or that the pilots don't have the necessary training because the budget is not there for them to take place in as many exercises as necessary. And this is, of course, also something that comes from the experience of other countries. For example, just before leaving Japan, the other day, I was talking to an American officer who is no longer in Japan, but who had spent some time as a liaison officer. Yes, sorry, I'll just say this, and that will be the end. And he had been spending some time helping the Japanese self-defense forces develop some necessary capabilities. And what he said was basically, in a few words, these guys are good, they are very hardworking, sometimes they know American doctrine better than we do because they read everything that we publish, but they need more training. They need to do things without thinking because they have done it so many times that it's just automatic. It's not enough to exercise once every year or once every couple of years. And he was talking about Japan. We were not talking about Catalonia, but that was something that really rang a bell because I have heard something similar when talking about people who are thinking, who are working on how to really do our duty, which is the first and foremost duty of any state, which is to preserve its own security and to contribute to help to preserving the security of its partners and allies. So yes, of course, the volume of the Catalan military is going to be smaller than the current volume of the Spanish military. And the volume of the Spanish military after Catalan independence is also going to be smaller. But there is no reason to believe that these two smaller militaries, when taken together in terms of capabilities, are going to be less than what Spain is now. So I'm confident that there will not be 4 planes from Spain here. There will be more, maybe 8, 10, plus 8 or 10 from Catalonia. There is really no reason to believe otherwise. Because the other angle to this is commitment. And this, again, I'm not going to go into detail because I don't want to sound negative, but we can look forward, hopefully, to a time when Spain doesn't have to worry about Catalonia leaving, because Catalonia has already left, and therefore they can devote their energies and their skills, which are sizable, and we have to recognize them, towards things like, for example, the Baltic Air Patrol. And just to conclude, I'm sorry because I've talked a little bit more than I was scheduled. I would like to stress something, because some of you may think, okay, you are telling us about plans, you're telling us about the future, you're telling us about learning from other countries, but these are all words. And as the saying goes, what matters is deeds, not words. And there is also another saying in English that talk is cheap. So I don't want to simply talk about what Catalonia intends to do. I would like to briefly mention what Catalonia has been doing over these last 3 years. And I will focus just on one single issue, which is that of prisons, prison management. Now, in Spain, all prisons are managed, they are the responsibility of the Spanish central government, with one exception, prisons in Catalonia. They have been managed for more than 20 years by the Catalan government. And the funny thing is that when the Catalan government asked for this, when they told Madrid, look, we want to manage prisons, we want to assume this responsibility, it is the only time in these 30 years that Madrid said, yes, here you are. No discussion, no bat, or no need for long negotiations. They were relieved. They thought, oh, these people are crazy. They want to manage prisons. Oh, you want prisons? Great. Do you want to manage prisons in Madrid as well? Yes, if you want, just send us your people and manage them. Why? Because as you can imagine, nobody, and there are some politicians in the audience here, and I'm sure that they can confirm this. No politician has won an election because of the way in which he managed prisons. If you are too harsh, if you keep people in their cells all day long, you are violating human rights. You will have all sorts of NGOs come and try to inspect the prisons. You are a dictator, and so on. If you let people away on the weekend, or you let them work during the day so that they can rehabilitate, they can pay their debt to society, then you are soft on crime. You are guilty if they commit some murder or rape or whatever while they are away. So whatever they do, whatever you do, you are going to be taking a lot of flack. You're going to be losing a lot of votes. But Catalonia, successive Catalan governments, because this has never changed when there has been a change in the ruling party, were aware of this, but wanted and stressed that they wanted to manage prisons. Why? Because they had something, and everybody has something very, very clear in their minds in Catalonia, that freedom and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. You can have both, or you can have neither. But what you cannot do, as sometimes children do, is to want the sweet part. To be free, to manage your own money, to build your infrastructure, to have your language protected and so on, but then to look the other way. When people tell you, look, we want some fighter planes here in Estonia because we have to protect the Baltic. So it's either all or nothing. And as the case of the prisons shows, Catalonia wants all. The rights, the liberties which come with independence, but also the duties and the responsibilities which come with it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Dr. Werk.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the process for independence is heavily a political issue, of course. But it also includes numerous legal aspects, both national and international. And what I want to do is speak a little bit about what international law says about self-determination. And the principle of self-determination probably became well known after the First World War, when President Wilson included this in his ideas how we should manage the post-war world. And the principle of self-determination was also included in the United Nations Charter. And since then, this principle has been mentioned frequently by politicians, by scholars, by all sorts of people. But it has been said that it is indeed perhaps the most often cited human right. But at the same time, it is not very well understood human right. What does it actually mean? And there are many ambiguities regarding self-determination, and I'd like to address some of them. Now, first of all, there are those who say that self-determination is closely linked to the colonial context, that the self-determination was intended and was used to break up empires, like the one for example, the Russian Empire or the Ottoman Empire or even the British Empire. And if we look at different documents adopted by the General Assembly during the Cold War, most of these documents indeed speak about self-determination in one way or another in colonial context. So there are those who say that self-determination is now a thing of the past because there is no colonial context anymore. And today we should not use the principle of self-determination in the same way as we did in the post-Second World War context. Now, this of course does not satisfy all the nations who still have aspirations for independence and wish to have their own state. Now, states also cite self-determination. They say that this is a fundamental principle of international law, it's a fundamental principle of international relations, it's a fundamental human right, and so on and so on. But in practice, we don't see that states are very enthusiastic about actually practicing self-determination or allowing someone to exercise self-determination. The reason is that if someone, a nation or a territory becomes an independent state, it means that they will lose their own territory. So for example, if you would ask Norway, Sweden, Finland, Russia, whether they support the idea of self-determination, they probably will say yes, of course. But let's say that one day the Sami people in the north, they say that we wish to have a Sami land. Do you think that all of these 4 countries are happily applying this principle and allowing Samis to have their own country? Then, of course, they are more reluctant about the principle of self-determination. So there's a huge ambiguity, and states what they do and what they say, there's a huge difference. And today, it is often said that we should distinguish between 2 types of self-determination. That we can speak about external self-determination, which indeed means that a nation, the people, can decide to have their own independent state. And we should also speak about internal self-determination. Internal self-determination is applicable when we have a functioning democratic state. But within this functioning democratic state, there is a nation or the people who are different from the majority. And therefore, they should have the right to exercise their culture. They should have more say what happens in their territory. So that's why, according to internal self-determination, these people should have the right for autonomy, for example. And this is what the Canadian court said in case of Quebec. They said that Canada is a functioning democracy where the fundamental freedoms and rights of all people are guaranteed, and there is no reason, therefore, to break up a functioning country. But because the people of Quebec are different from the rest of the population of Canada, they should indeed have autonomy, extensive autonomy. And when we also look international documents, the Declaration of Friendly Relations, for example, adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations, it does include a clause saying that the principle of self-determination should not be used as a pretext to break up existing states. So it doesn't mean that we cannot at all use the principle of self-determination these days. But it seems that international law is a bit skeptical, and also that the state practice is skeptical. International law indeed seem to favor stability, integrity of state, and does not really hail the idea that let every nation, every people have their own state. I do understand that in this context I'm not a popular guy now because of saying this, but this is what international law at least seems to speak about. Now, of course, there is a case of Kosovo, and as Lauri also mentioned, the International Court of Justice gave its advisory opinion on Kosovo. It's an interesting opinion. First of all, because the International Court of Justice only dedicated 6 paragraphs on the general international law dealing with self-determination. 6 paragraphs. This is basically nothing. And secondly, it didn't say much in these 6 paragraphs. It didn't either actually confirm that the people have the right of succession, but it didn't also deny this. And the court was also clever. The court was asked whether the unilateral declaration of independence by Kosovo is in accordance with international law. So it is actually allowed by international law. The court actually twisted the question and said that what we are answering is whether this is in violation of international law. And this is a completely different story. And now when we look what the court actually said, the court said that the Declaration of Independence itself is not a violation of international law. So declaring independence, so the act of declaring, it refused to discuss whether this actually means that the people have the right of succession. They did not answer the question whether Kosovo was a state, whether the others had the obligation to recognize Kosovo, or perhaps have a duty not to recognize Kosovo. So there was very little that the court actually said. And that's why it's interesting that if someone is using Kosovo case to support their independence case, it's not very favorable in that sense. I have said that this Kosovo advisory opinion is like a holy text, like a Bible or Quran that you can use to support basically whatever position you have. There is an idea that in international law is what we call remedial self-determination, which means that if the people are not guaranteed the basic rights, basic freedoms, then as a last resort, they should be able to have their own state. So it's like a remedy against violation. And this is an argument that was used by Kosovo, for example. But interestingly, the International Court of Justice did not confirm this idea. So there wasn't really much that the court said, or anything very, very useful, except that if you declare as something independent, it is not against international law. So it means that if we today here declare this auditorium an independent state, this is not against the international law. But what are the effects of this declaration? This the court did not address. So what I'm trying to say is that international law is unfortunately very ambiguous about self-determination. You can find arguments in favor, arguments against, but for me it seems that international law, at least today, favors stability, integrity, and does not, is not very enthusiastic about successions. Of course, it does not mean that it is not possible to use international law to support one's aspirations, but simply that international law is not very strong on this issue. So that's all I have at the moment.
I'm sure that raised lots of questions amongst the audience, but first we'll hear Dr. Girnius, and then we'll come to the audience.
Okay, just a few comments about what's been discussed. The principle of self-determination, which Wilson announced in 1917 to such great glory, was violated immediately because in the Versailles Treaty, for example, it was explicitly stated that Austrians could not join Germany. Again, national self-determination for everyone but the Austrians. At the same time, also, there was no right to self-determination for the Germans in the Sudetenland, because if you took a look at the actual situation, you would not have had Czechoslovakia, you would have Czecho-Germania, because the Germans were the second largest national grouping within the borders of the new Czechoslovak state. So it's a principle that's announced, but it is one that is usually violated because you do have a certain, the clear conflict that was already mentioned between the rights of people to choose how they live with the sort of concern about what would happen if secession is permitted from perfectly normally functioning states who are respecting more or less the rights of their people, and therefore that this would be disintegrating. Again, there is always the fear that if you make secession that easy, any national minority can put itself into put itself into a way that it can blackmail the local government, i.e. something is being discussed, say, let's say even example, Catalonia. If, for example, it were permitted, if secession were immediately allowed without great difficulties, I could imagine, say, the people in Navarre coming out and saying, unless you give us certain special rights, we will try to secede. Now, the question is, international law matters, but I think it's rather, as mentioned, it's not very clear. And the other point to remember is that the law follows morality to a certain degree. If people believe a certain system, that is, certain laws no longer, for example, if people are convinced that a certain law forbids a practice that now is perfectly normal, they expect the law to be changed. I think a classic example would be now that first, 10, 15 years ago, gay marriages were absolutely forbidden. People are thinking that it's okay now. They are expecting the law to be changed. Similarly, when you had in the United States, you had laws on board that basically permitted discrimination and segregation against blacks. The moral attitudes changed. The law had to change. So if the law exists as it now is, that is no guarantee that it will last forever and that it should be dispositive. Again, let's take a look. Let us assume that, for example, Gorbachev had been really clever. And in 1986, decided that there may be a problem of secession. And he passed a law saying that any vote on secession has to include the whole of the Soviet Union. So therefore, in contrast to the law that you had before, say that the Soviet Constitution was changed in a way that it was determined that any secession would have to be approved by all of the people of the Soviet Union. I do not think the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Estonians, and others would have thought that this kind of question, this kind of determination is binding, even if it is part of the Constitution. This does say something about the unitary state of Spain. Now, the other question, the question that was asked, remember, okay, everyone is for self-determination until someone tries to leave your own territory. They mentioned about the Samis in Finland. That's a good example. Another good example, I remember in 1989, it was when Lithuania was really moving toward independence, you had the Polish regions, and again, in Lithuania, Poles constitute about 7% of the population, which is very, very small, although they're concentrated in eastern Lithuania. That you had Sheinin and other people who had something who were planning the putsch. They were traveling to eastern Lithuania, to the Polish regions, arguing that they should try to secede from Lithuania. So you can similarly imagine, I mean, what really would decide is who gets to vote. If you had the vote in the eastern regions of Lithuania, they probably would have voted for independence. If you had the vote in all of Lithuania, there would be no independence for the Polish regions. If you had the vote was to take place on the Soviet Union as a whole, then the answer would have been that they would have decided what Gorbachev would have said, and the Polish regions would have succeeded, not succeeded, but it would have been there. So the question, I think, what arises in a case like this is who gets the right to vote? Who gets the right to vote on a question of secession? And again, I think there is no very clear answer as far as this is concerned, but to some degree, I think Catalonia, as Scotland, they have a relatively good case. One of the things is size. Size does matter. If the Polish regions, for example, wanted to secede from Lithuania, the one region where they really are concentrated, I think, has 50,000 inhabitants. Do you want to recognize a state of 50,000? I think not. The other thing is, the other factors, another important factor is, remember, secession is when the people decide that they don't want to live under a certain government. There are two options. If you are unhappy with the government, you may try to overthrow the government, or the other thing is you simply let the government stay, but you leave. But the secessionist wants to leave with his territory. And then the question arises, are they entitled to this territory? Who is the owner of the territory that the secessionists want to take place? Again, it would be a touch and go question, say, in eastern Latvia or in eastern, say, eastern Estonia, where people would say that, okay, maybe this is Russian dominated at the moment, but these people have come and settled only recently, and therefore they do not have claim to the land. There are three theories. The state owns it, the nation owns it, or the people, all of the citizens of the territory own it. In this case, I think Catalonia comes out fairly well because, first of all, it's a historical territory. It's been there for about 1,000 years. The borders changed a little bit one way or the other, but there's no doubt there has always been a Catalonia. Second of all, they've had statehood. Ferdinand made a mistake when he married Isabella, but that's another matter. He couldn't foresee what was going to happen 300 years down the line, but that was the case. And also the secessionist movement in Catalonia is broadly based. It is not based on ethnic Catalonians, it's based on a civic society where everyone who lives, everyone can vote. So I mean, I think that is an important matter that should be taken into account. And also, so you have a history of statehood, you have size, you have a unique nation, and you have a claim to a clearly defined territory. Again, I think that is a solid basis. But again, I really don't think it's dispositive. I think because very complicated, how do you say that only the Catalans have the right to vote for their secession? One of the arguments that is sort of bandied about is that, look at, say the three of us decide to join an organization or to associate among ourselves. No fourth person can come in and say that we don't have the right to form an association that we want. This is our choice. We can make that decision. The argument is then similarly the inhabitants of Catalonia want to live together. Who else has the right to prevent this? But the problem with that is, with that kind of comparison and parallel thing, it's just not the three of us here. There's also a fourth person, say the Spaniard living in Barcelona who wants to remain within the state. And his argument then would be, look at, you aren't taking into account my opinion. I want to associate with the rest of Spain. I will be prevented from this. So again, in a case like this, it becomes a little bit complicated, but I still come back. If you fundamentally believe that the people have a right to choose, that the legitimacy of a government depends on the support of the people, and you can imagine a secession which would ensure, which would guarantee the rights of all the inhabitants, the possibility of doing this in sort of a civilized fashion, then as I say, I think a fairly good case can be made for this. And again, if you can make the case for, again, the fact that you probably cannot make a case for many other countries doesn't mean that you can't make the case for Catalonia. If you can argue against the Samis, if you can argue for various reasons against eastern Ukraine, eastern Latvia or eastern Estonia or the Polish regions, that doesn't mean that if some groups have pretensions to independence and self-determination, the fact that there are arguments against that doesn't mean that there are universal arguments against that as a whole. And I was supposed to comment on what other people said, and I've been just yakking away, but I will ask Alex one question. First of all, first a comment. He mentioned that if Catalonia became an independent country, you would have 8 + 8 jet fighters on the NATO support issue. I think this is the only people who will most rejoice at this will be the Latvians, because they're the only ones without a base for the air mission, and if there were 16 fighters, they could plead one of their bases also become a basis point. But my question would be, is in the discussion of the run-up to independence, are these kinds of questions, say commitment to NATO, increased defense spending, talked about at all among the Catalans? Or is it a topic that people would like to keep under the table because this would probably entail greater expenses and no one wants to spend money that they need not to spend?
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, actually, now that you mentioned this, in Barcelona there is a very interesting place. Actually, it's the archaeological remains of a quarter of the city which was bombed extensively during the War of Spanish Succession, and then afterwards, after the Spanish occupation, it was turned into a fortress to keep an eye on the city, not to protect it. And then recently, there was an intention to build a library, so they started building it, and they found out all these remains. So now it's a kind of cultural center, which I recommend that you visit if you happen to go to Barcelona and you're interested in military history and battlefield archaeology. And in this cultural center called Born, every month there is a conference by somebody, maybe an intellectual, a politician, or talking about different issues. And the last one, which was I think a couple of weeks ago, if I remember correctly, the Catalan president was there, and he talked openly about the need to rebuild our military as part of any state. I mean, there are no, well, yes, we could talk about a few micro-states, but other than that, state and military are basically two sides of the equation. So this is being talked openly. He mentioned NATO, Catalonia's commitment to NATO membership. All the arguments in favor of continued European Union membership from a legal and practical perspective, I would say, are applicable even more so to NATO. So the debate is public. It is true, I mean, that's for sure, that some people are a bit uncomfortable, but that's normal because they are like children who would like the sweet side of freedom but not the responsibilities. But these people are a minority, and they are a shrinking minority, because as this prospect of independence becomes closer, as this ceases to be a dream, and of course, we are aware that it's going to be difficult, so nobody's saying that it's just pressing a button. But as it's no longer some kind of faraway dream, people start thinking hard about what it means to, again, have your own state. So yes, people are talking about NATO, and people are talking about the military. A number of unofficial white papers have been published, also in English. So if you can read them in English as well. One concerning land forces, one the Air Force, and the other one the Navy. What I said earlier about this stress on maintenance and intensive training is very clear in these unofficial white papers, because of the experience of many NATO countries, who, when called upon to provide a certain force, are unable to do so, because that force exists on paper, but, for example, there is no transportation. There is no point in having a tank if you cannot take it somewhere by plane. So it's better to have maybe fewer tanks and have a few transport planes. So this experience by existing NATO member states is being taken into account by Catalonia, because, of course, nobody likes not to be independent. Let's be honest. That's why usually once you're independent, you never renounce to this independence unless you are forced to. But the fact that for a period of time you are not independent has the advantage that when you are preparing to again be independent, you can learn from the experience of other countries. So you can say, okay, why does this NATO member, which has 100 tanks, why is it unable to take part in an exercise somewhere else on the other side of the Atlantic Alliance? Oh, because maybe they bought too many tanks and they didn't buy transport planes, or the tanks are too heavy for this kind of transport plane. So I believe that Catalonia can benefit from this experience. This is one of the reasons why there are already being a lot of talks and a lot of contacts to make sure that what we do fits with the needs of the alliance, so that we are net security contributors. This is a very important concept which I forgot to mention earlier. We want to ensure that we are not security consumers, but net security contributors.
Right. Now, finally, the audience. You've probably been waiting for your opportunity to have your own thoughts or to challenge anything that's been said by any of the speakers. So who would like to use this opportunity? Don't be shy. It's supposed to be a debate.
You're looking at me for some reason. I definitely have I don't know, so many things to say that has been totally like a total trick. Actually, yeah. Well, who am I? I'm Juan. I live in Estonia, and clearly I'm Spanish. I don't know which one of the statements is more outrageous, in my opinion. But clearly, there are some that we could start with. First of all, the comparison. It's been called a parallelism between the history of Spain and the history of Estonia. More particularly, the history, or let's say Catalonia. More particularly, the history of Spain and the history of the USSR. Making comparison, a parallelism is being called between state of the European Union in our time, a democratic state, and the USSR has been particularly unfortunate. This you said that you're not.
Can I just add to that? I was more interested in the parallel between the European empires. In the 19th century, the Russian Empire was considered to be part of the concert of Europe. So I agree with you, the Soviet Union was a totalitarian state in the way that Spain, even Franco Spain, for sure wasn't. But you cannot make such a distinction in the 19th century European empires. So in this sense, to discover how the European empires expanded in the early 18th century, or how they changed territories, I would say that is standard European history, right? But please go on with your point.
You know, it would have been nice to have some historian here to actually talk about history, and I'm not going to do that. But all these comparisons and parallelisms are very unfortunate in any case. I have not heard that the Catalonians have been treated by Spain in any case like the USSR treated the Estonians. I still have to hear a good reason why all this started. I'm talking about the Catalonians suddenly, not suddenly, I take that back, but feeling that they are oppressed or prosecuted or anything at all in a democratic state where they are able to actually organize this kind of events with public money and without anybody really giving a check on the purported facts that have been presented here, which I think that I just can't go through all the notes. I'm sorry. However, that's I think is an important point, and perhaps one other I would like to say is about who the people is here in this case. And yes, it is important that everybody in the country called Spain vote about this slicing where, excuse me, but Barcelona is my country. Okay, you know, everybody here. I think Dalí is particularly popular in Estonia. Dalí is my countryman. Okay, that's it. So you feel something, we feel something, and basically I don't see what we're doing to you. But now you claim, well, we have the people. It has been stated here today that this is a grassroots movement coming bottom up to create the situation. This is probably one of the biggest mistakes or deviations from the fact. And not only because of the supposed movement or origin, but also because of the facts of the polls themselves. It's been called a popular consultation or something like that took place a few months ago, November, thank you. This was organized by the organizers of the movement. Everything was in their hands, okay? In order for them to get even better results of whatever they wanted to accomplish, they allowed children under the age of voting, under the legal age of voting, they allowed them to come in and vote. They will know why they did this. I mean, I would say that they were expecting better results because of this. And so they did this, and they had other other irregularities, but I think that this is the one of the most interesting. Even in that circumstances, under their control of the poll, their boxes, everything, bringing in people that don't have the legal right to vote anything, then it happens that only they came to vote a third of the population of what they call their people, okay? So 70% of those called to vote in their conditions, in their favorable conditions, they didn't even care to go to vote this thing. And by their own statement of the people who did go to vote, who did care to vote, 80% voted yes. That is 20% voted no. So we're not looking at anything close to 30% of the population who supposedly want to the independence, blah, blah, blah. No. Okay. And this is their voting, their poll taking, and their data. So how can you support that you're going to take away from me, from my country, a part of a country, of a region of my own country, who is so autonomous and has so many perks and so many recognitions to their history that they have all sorts of fiscal and other types of benefits for the sake of that long history, of that long nationality that is among us in Spain as one of the privileged, and then you want to take that away from them. So I really don't see any of this, and I think I will let somebody else do it.
Sorry, what is your question?
Thank you. Professor Goodness.
Yeah.
No, but actually, there is no question. I will respond something that's not the question.
You mentioned the comparison with the Soviet Union. I think you misunderstood the point I was trying to make. I was trying to make 2 points. First of all, when I mentioned the Soviet constitution and assuming that, let me finish.
Excuse me, I was talking to, I'm sorry, your name's Laurie. Laurie, in my statement, I wasn't really...
Okay, no, but I would like to take the point. I mean, the reason I mentioned the Soviet Union and the Soviet constitution, the point is that if you just because a certain constitution exists, that doesn't mean if people think that it is morally unacceptable that they need to abide by it. Just simply passing a certain kind of law doesn't necessarily determine the fate of a nation. The other thing I was talking about, using the example of the Polish minority, is of course the question is that to a great degree the result of a referendum depends on who gets to vote. If you can determine what proportion of the population is allowed to vote, then you fairly well know who is going to get the result. And I think what the Catalonian case is important is the following question. There is theoretically a right to self-determination. The right to self-determination formally is not limited to repressed people. So my question is, if self-determination is a right that non-oppressed nations have, then surely a case can be made for Catalonia. That's all.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate your point, and I wasn't actually discussing that, which basically you're thinking about it and you're posing questions, but it's not very clear that you actually gave an answer, but that's fine. That wasn't my point of my intervention, which is basically to actually have a debate, not to question, because I'm not making any question. Not in this case. I have a few questions I will pose later after, let somebody else perhaps have some intervention. But it was basically debating. Okay, so, but thank you for the clarification.
Thank you, René, and then Professor Hint.
One point I want to make. The International says that the people have the right of self-determination. And what's interesting is that international law does not really clarify who the people are. Of course, we usually do have a good understanding who constitutes the people, but there is no specific document underlying that this is the people. Yes, UNESCO years ago adopted a document saying that it is a group that has a common language, cultural heritage, and so on and so on. But it also says that it is a group of people who actually feel themselves as people. So this is very much open to discussion. Who is the people? And of course, who is the people has a determining effect on the result of a referendum. So if, for example, we speak about Western Sahara, if we would have a referendum in Western Sahara, so who should we ask? Should we ask the people who lived in Western Sahara before Moroccan regime occupied the land, or should we ask everyone who is living today? So depending on who we ask, we will have a different result. So it's a huge question. Who is the people?
Professor Hind?
I would like to point out that it's very easy to manipulate the question who has the right to take part in decision making, who has the right to vote. We have to decide, to define who is a right Catalan or who is a right Estonian. For example, nowadays, being more than 20 years independent, we have in Estonia discussions that in mixed families, the children, or nowadays not anymore children, who have been born in mixed families, with Estonian mother and Russian father, if one person has a right-wing political opinions, views, he is 100% or even more a real Estonian. If in a mixed family son has social democratic political views, he is not as much Estonian. And this is a very complicated question to make decision who has the right to take part in decision making. Thank you.
We've got already 3 questions coming. Let me collect some of these. Please. And then
because normally I'm used to be saying when I talk, so
Teacher.
yeah, I'm a teacher, so mina olen Nesta Liberal, mina olen hispaania keele õpetaja ja Hispaania maja juhataja. Tere hommikust, buenos días, dobre dien, bon dia. It's been, it's also difficult for me to ask a question because I don't know to who ask a question. And I feel like asking a question to the audience, not to, well, I feel like asking a question to Gilnius and to Marek also because they gave some interesting things. For example, well, first I would like to say that Spain has a democratic constitution since 1978. All Spaniards voted for a democratic constitution. All Spaniards, I mean Spain. All the regions of Spain who still didn't exist then. Then the regions were constituted. We have 16 regions. Like Catalonia, 16. It's not Catalonia and then the rest of the world. And Catalonia is alone, suffering an awful repression. There is no food in the shops. There is people are being killed on the streets. People sending to the Gulag and all these things. Spain is a democracy with imperfections, like Estonia. Probably Spain more imperfections. We are living the strongest crisis since 2009. We have a very strong economic crisis. And the funny thing is, six years ago, the Catalan government is putting all the resources on the following. Catalonia has manages the prisons. Catalonia manages education system 100%, manages the television, manages the healthcare, manages. It's the region of Spain who most autonomous from all Spain, and probably Spain is one of the biggest federal countries in the world. You can have Germany, you can have Switzerland. Switzerland is much more. We can have the United States. So the crisis is also being very strong in Catalonia. And I asked myself, for 6 years, I could make a comparison with the Soviet Union right now. Soviet Union was based on violence and propaganda. In Catalonia there is no violence, of course, but there is propaganda. They are for 6 years putting all the money in propaganda, in education and in television. For example, I asked myself, how much costs this event that we have here for 2 hours? How many thousands of euros has cost this? And then the educational system in Catalonia is going down. It was one of the best of Europe, of Spain. It's going down to the worst. Healthcare is one of the, hospitals are having long waiting lists, and all these problems you can have. So, Catalonia votes. We have 4 elections in Spain this year. 4, not only Catalonia. We have Andalusian elections, so everybody speaks about Catalonia. Andalusian elections in 1 month. In May, local elections. All Spain is voting. Catalonians are voting. Nobody's taking out the vote from them. Then, in September, Catalonia is voting, and in Catalonia there are members of the parliament against what we are hearing here. And in the parliament of Spain, we have members who are from Catalonia asking for more rights. The Spanish parliament voted 90% against the situation that is going on in Catalonia. 90%. Okay? And then September, and then we have national elections also, that we can change the government in Madrid. So I have a few questions, for example, to Mr. Girnius. He said, okay, we have 3 people here, we want to decide something, we are in Catalonia, and then there is a 4th person who is in Catalonia, but he's Spaniard, I heard. I said, who decides who's Catalan? Who decides who's Spanish? First. I cannot vote in Catalonia if I would like to vote in the Catalan elections. But of course, Catalan people don't vote in Andalusian elections. It's obvious. But if it is cutting into pieces my country, because my country is where my memory is, where my experience is, and where I live. So my country is also Barcelona, because I lived in Barcelona. My country is in Madrid, my country is Almeria, in the south of Spain. My country is Europe. I feel a European, and I don't like borders, and I don't like you said, sir, the confrontation in the families, in the neighborhoods. I don't like this. And in Spain, there is no need for that. And 6 years ago, this confrontation is erasing. And the last thing, the headquarters of the party who is promoting this has been sequestrated by the justice because of corruption. One of the strongest corrupt parties in Catalonia is a leading party. Can you imagine? The politician who has the longest period in power in Catalonia has been sending his money to Andorra and to Switzerland, and now he's being prosecuted with all families. All of them, where he takes the money away. Yeah?
Okay.
So who is the correct Catalan, who is not, and who can vote to decide the future of Spain?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yuri Adams.
Thank you. My question is to Catalan presenters here about possible transition plans and the going of the present state to an independent state. It probably takes a lot of time. I think at least 2 or 3 years in the case of, let's say, peaceful separations. As far as I can remember from the European history of last 110 years, there have been 4 cases of more or less peaceful separations. First, I think, was Norway got its independence from Sweden. Then it came, or maybe it was later, I don't know which was, Republic of Ireland or Iceland. Republic of Ireland got its independence from Great Britain, and Iceland from Denmark. And the latest case is a separation of Czechoslovak Republic into 2, Czech Republic and Slovak Republic. There are probably things that can be learned as positive examples what to do, and maybe things that should be rejected. This is not the way to do a country, and no one up to now has mentioned that there exists a good written document, a blueprint, what the transition process will be. In the defense field was mentioned, but there are many other fields. Maybe I'm not correct, maybe it's still in discussion. So this is my general idea, what I would personally learn more about the Catalan case.
Let's take one more question, then we'll come to... Yeah.
Actually, I have two. One of them would be that one of the questions is about the Spanish...
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry. My name is Siim Tuisk. I'm a social democrat and running for the parliament as well. But this is irrelevant currently. My question was about the Spanish politics. Do you think that the rise of Podemos will change the consensus on the Catalan issue? And the second question is to the Spanish currently here. Do you think that there is a possibility of a Scottish-style referendum in the country? And would you support that kind of a referendum yourself? And if not, then why? Two questions. So, to whomever feels that they're confident on responsible to respond on the Podemos issue, and to the Spanish currently here.
Well, Alex, you've been...
Yes, actually the Podemos issue...
But let's try to keep every of the answers brief,
yes,
so everyone has a chance.
Yes, I'll be very brief. I'm going to concentrate, if you don't mind, to the gentleman here who asked about the transition. We are aware that this is very important, not only for Catalonia and for Spain, but for the whole of the European Union and NATO. As I said, there are a number of unofficial blueprints concerning the military. There are also other documents concerning aspects of security, such as, for example, nuclear safety, which is very important for France, because radioactivity knows no borders. So as you can imagine, the French government wants to know what is going to happen the day after to the nuclear power stations located in Catalonia. And actually here I have to thank the the think tank I mentioned earlier, the Royal United Services Institute, because last summer they published a paper on the accession of Catalonia to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that's on their website, that's also on the website of Diplocat. And this is the right approach that the British follow, and that unfortunately we don't hear from our Spanish neighbors, because instead of talking about practical issues, they have these romantic speeches, and that's all they can say. So yes, the documents are there. Barcelona City Council recently published a document which is also available in English, talking about what independence would mean for the city. And this includes, for example, security of diplomatic delegations. So at all times, although I have to agree, I'm not going to try to paint a kind of rosy picture, some people still have to get on board on this. So we still have some people who don't understand that freedom and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. But the main actors, the people who are working on this, understand that we have to look at the details, and that we have to give responses, give answers to the legitimate questions that other countries are going to have. Somebody is going to say, okay, when my consulate is an embassy, who is going to be responsible for protecting it, for example. And just one last thing, you mentioned the case of Ireland. Unfortunately, that was not very peaceful, but just to give an example of a document which has been studied and examined very closely in Catalonia is the recent agreement on defense cooperation between Ireland and the UK. Now, this is important on a practical basis, because the British Army has very strong capabilities, but the Irish have a long peacekeeping experience. So it's good to see these two forces cooperate. And of course, needless to say, Catalans are aware that we'll have to also do our duty in terms of peacekeeping. So let everybody be reassured about this. But it's also important because it means that two countries which had a difficult divorce, so to speak, and a very violent one, and actually it was just a few years ago that the IRA was still planting bombs. So we're talking about a very recent past. The fact that these two countries are able to work together in terms of training, in terms of equipment, is our ideal, because as I said, we want to come here with our planes, and we want to be side by side with the Spanish Air Force. So this is what we want.
No, the Podemos.
Right. I think for the Estonians here, and for the general European audience, who would be able to enlighten us about this Podemos question? Because looking at it from the outside, what people are talking about Spain, is Podemos.
Podemos is in the media every day, let's say. And even as it's a new party and has a lot of followers and support, people in general doesn't know what they are going to do if they would be in power. So the leader went to Barcelona 1 month ago. It was the first act he did publicly in Spain. It was in Barcelona. And he talked there and he said, yes, I support the right of voting of the Catalans, he said. And then he said, I support the right of voting of Catalans concerning healthcare, education, the support of referendum, about every aspect of the everyday life. And the right of independence of Catalonia, this is not the topic right now. I care about the people in Spain and about the people in Catalonia. And then the parties that who were a bit enthusiastic in Catalonia, that, oh, Podemos is going to support us. When he said this, and Podemos is quite a modern movement, and those who are not supporting independence in Catalonia, the Catalan independents say that those who don't support us are like let's say, old-fashioned. So then this person said, yeah, Podemos is also old-fashioned. And when you see this leader with long hair and political science professor call him old-fashioned, and you see these leaders in Catalonia who are in the power for 30 years, and in the power for 30 years and calling it old-fashioned to this new, fresh movement going on in Spain, it's kind of, they don't know what to say anymore in order to accuse the people who don't support them. They cannot answer back anymore, because people are starting to answer lately, on the situation in Catalonia. It was like we were not thinking about it, but at the end, people all around Spain are talking about this, and we're thinking, hey, what's going on? They want to cut my country to pieces. So people are now, it's everyday politics all around Spain.
Okay, we have Albert back there, and Thomas, but Dr. Girnes wants to come in here as well, and then we'll have one more round of questions, and then we can wrap up.
My only point was there was no follow-up on the question. Why don't you, especially when you seem so confident of the fact that most Catalans are against independence, why do you not permit a Scottish-style referendum in Catalonia?
No, I didn't say most.
No. I'm asking why are the opponents? What are the fundamental arguments against permitting a Scottish-type, as he asked, a Scottish-type referendum on Catalonian independence? Granted that you seem relatively confident that there's no real support for it.
I didn't say a majority of Catalans is.
No, I didn't
say that.
I said it.
You said. Oh.
I mean, not that I said it. It's what they hold. It's their own
in the elections, yeah.
It is their own statement that about 30% of the people called to this vote showed up, and then only 80% was a positive vote. It's their own
sorry, you are not answering this question.
Why not permit a referendum?
No.
So, you know, in Scotland they had the referendum, the independence people lost, the question is buried.
Okay, then I can turn what I said before into a question. Somebody tell me why it should happen, because nobody is harming them.
So they have
the
answer the question.
Excuse me, I'm talking. They have the freest region in Spain and in Europe and whatever you look at. So I still want to know why they want to split my country. This is my question. I mean, I don't have to explain why not. Somebody explain me why.
Sorry, but there is a question and both of you are avoiding it. So could you please, any of you?
What question didn't I answer?
Well, the question from the gentleman from the Social Democrat Party.
Excuse me, the question
which was later repeated
Well,
by a member of the panel.
That's all right, because we're here on the panel. We're the ones responsible to answer. You don't have to answer, because
no, I know it's not.
you can if you like, but the panel has the responsibility to answer all the questions. The audience doesn't have to answer questions if they don't.
Well,
don't want.
Unfortunately,
but Albert, I think, wanted to come in. Albert, I think, might have an answer for you. Okay? Albert, now, okay?
Okay, I think that you can see that this discussion can be very emotional, especially from one side, the Spanish side. it's quite crystal clear how this
What Spanish side? What do you mean?
sentiment.
I don't understand the Spanish side.
It's
Very weird.
It's quite clear how this sentiment of ownership is being of the Catalan soil is being used by one part of in this political discussion. But just to answer to one question which was posed, you were asking about how that 9 November vote took place and all the rules that were used. Listen, if you were not happy with that, please do organize a referendum. We are happy that you organize a referendum. That we've been struggling for it for 3 years. Please do organize it. According to the Spanish law, we want a legal referendum.
How can we organize? I'm a citizen. You are getting public money from the Estonian government. I am working in Estonia. How can I organize anything? I don't understand the question, organize. I can't organize anything.
Okay, we have some more. Thomas, and then we have
Thank you.
We have the first female question
My name is
coming up.
Thomas. I also live in Estonia, and I would like to put aside these comparisons of Soviet Union and Spain, especially in concern of the democracy of both countries of the Soviet Union and Spain nowadays. And I would just draw a parallel in the mentality of people of those days. I remember in the Soviet Union and of your country, the Kingdom of Spain. In both cases, I'm putting aside the democracy and the democratic system or not, or the absence of it. But in both cases, there were people and there are people who are afraid of you are splitting my country, because the Soviets really felt living in Vladivostok that this is my country, Tbilisi, this is my country. Vilnius, this is also my country. Sergei Bubka is my athlete, and so on. They felt, I mean, the majority of the Soviet population, which was the Russians, they felt that the collapse of the Soviet Union was splitting their country. And what's happening now in Europe is also the consequence of that, because many of the Soviets are still feeling that they split our country. We lost parts of our country. But the question is now that if the Russians or the Soviet people, they really felt that they were losing parts of their country those days. And now they are fighting to get some back. We know everybody. But the question is that those who left the Soviet Union those days, and in the case of Catalans, who are trying perhaps to leave Spain now, whether they concern also that in our Estonian case, we didn't feel that the Soviet Union was the whole Soviet Union was our country. I didn't feel that Murmansk was part of our country, Vladivostok was part of our country. I didn't feel that. Or Vilnius was part of my country. It was not the case. So the question or the answer, both, is in the mentality of the people, whether the Catalans feel that Madrid and Zaragoza and all the other places in Spain are their country, or they're feeling the opposite. And if there is a harmony between the mentality of the Catalans and the mentality of the Castilians, then the vote will be no. But if there is contradiction in between that, then you are not going, please do not let them vote, they will leave.
Here's a question up here.
Yes, I have a question.
Introduce yourself.
Sorry, I'm Denise. I'm studying in Tallinn University. I'm from Mexico. And well, we are talking about implications for the EU, but we just talk about NATO. But I think, I have the doubt, what will happen with economic considerations? I don't know, the crisis, for example, what if, if you go to Spain, you move from region to region, every region is like a different country. They speak different kind of Spanish. So if this happens, for example, what will happen with the crisis or the economic trades with the European Union? That is my question.
Okay, well, we had two very good questions. One about sort of the genuine, sincere feeling of people who think in different ways, and something that actually we didn't address very much here about the implications. We talked very much about the legal and security, But in fact, we haven't touched upon the economic side. So it's good that you brought
For
that up.
example, Schengen. That,
Schengen as well. So, who would like to touch upon that first here?
I would presume if Spain does not veto Catalonia's entry, there won't be problems.
Well, actually, this reminds me once in class of somebody. I had a German student who said, I don't know why she said it, because actually we were not talking about this. We were talking about something which had nothing to do with Catalonia, but she made a comment. She made, Spain will never recognize Catalonia. And she caught me a bit by surprise, because we were not talking about this. And just off the cuff, I said, oh, great. This way we will not have to pay part of the Spanish national debt. Of course, this is a joke, because Catalonia doesn't intend to contribute to existing economic troubles worldwide. But it is a given in international law, and here we have more distinguished voices in this field, that somebody cannot take up part of somebody else's debt unless that somebody is recognized by the original holder of the debt. So if, let's imagine for a second, Catalonia becomes independent de facto, but Spain does not recognize Catalonia. Well, then Catalonia, even if Catalonia wants, cannot take over part of the Spanish national debt. And it is doubtful, I don't want to sound too dramatic, but it is doubtful that Spain would be able to not even repay, let's forget about repaying, but even service her national debt only with the economic resources of Spain proper. And that would mean the risk of a default with all the domino impact on the Eurozone. Of course, before that happens, as you can imagine, there are going to be a few phone calls to whoever is in office in Madrid. And basically, the people who are going to phone whoever is in office in Madrid, that person, I don't know what he's going to think about self-determination, because as Professor Varg explained very well, this is a bit ambiguous, it's not black or white. So I don't think that those phone calls are going to be motivated by any consideration of human rights or anything like that. Those phone calls are going to be purely pragmatic. The purpose of those phone calls is not going to be to defend human rights or to defend the right to self-determination or to worry about Catalan history. The only reason why these phone calls are going to take place is to save the Eurozone. And basically, what these phone calls are going to say is, look, yes, you are right, you are very ancient, we feel your pain, we know you love Dali or whatever. So there's going to be a bit of course, of chit talk to an expression of sympathy. But after that, look, we have a problem and we have to solve it. So do it at midnight or do it in August when everybody is on holiday, but you have to recognize Catalonia and we'll force Catalonia to take over a portion of your national debt. And this is actually already expected and already written in this document that I was referring to in reply to a question on the transition. So this is the only pragmatic solution. So what we are not going to see in Catalonia is the kind of frozen conflict that we see in some parts of the former Soviet Union, where we have a territory which is de facto independent, or some people call it a protectorate because it's actually in the hands of a larger neighbor, but which is not recognized by the parent state. And this is because, one, Spain cannot service her national debt without an agreement with Catalonia, and also because when you look at the map, you see that most Spanish exports, not just exports in general, economic interactions with the European Union go through Catalonia. And I understand, and I'm not mocking them, but I understand that this is very painful for people in Spain who have been for many years trying to convince the French government to drill a tunnel through the Central Pyrenees so as to bypass Catalonia. But the French government, well, successive French governments have always refused this, always, no matter which party was in power. So we have what we could call in military terms a blocking position. And this is no threat, it's simply a reality from the map. So there is no possibility of a frozen conflict. Of course, and we have to be realistic here. At first, those phone calls may not go to Madrid, they may go to Barcelona. So we may get a few phone calls saying, look, why don't you try to patch things up? Why don't you try to at least remain in Spain for a few years until the crisis is over or whatever. So we're aware of this. I don't want to try to sell you a kind of rosy picture. But if we are strong enough and we really show that we mean business, then those same phone calls are going to go to Madrid, as I said, not because of any legal or human rights consideration. So we are quite confident. And then just very quickly, the other thing you said, yes, I'm sorry that I'm talking a lot about NATO. It's simply because of the current situation here in the Baltics, the meeting yesterday and so on. But we are, of course, committed not only to NATO. And we hope, just like, as I was saying, that we'll be here in the Baltic Air Patrol side by side with our Spanish neighbors. We also want to be side by side with our Spanish neighbors, for example, next time that there is a typhoon in the Philippines. Because I remember a couple of years ago, some people in the Japanese self-defense forces were surprised that Spain was not sending anything to the Philippines. And I think that the root of this problem is that if you tell the military of a country, look, your role is to keep people here, whatever they want, they cannot leave, then, of course, their role and their training and their equipment is not going to be geared towards assisting the civilian population in the Philippines when there is a typhoon. So once Spain is relieved of this need to keep Catalonia under its control, I believe, I'm confident that she will make a greater contribution to NATO, a greater contribution to the Baltic Air Patrol, and also a greater contribution to operations outside of the NATO area, for example, to humanitarian assistance in the Philippines whenever there is a typhoon, which unfortunately happens quite often.
Okay, just one quick response, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, or a comment, and perhaps it's a bad question. I would presume that the security of Europe and NATO and Estonia included is done through strong states, strong countries that contribute. Apparently, by slicing a little piece of it, is going to be, you know about the miracle of the fishes that multiply. I would like an explanation of how this piece of Spain, which I don't know where you would get your planes, but all of a sudden, instead of 4 Spanish planes, here we will have 8 Spanish planes and 8 Catalonian planes, jet fighters, patrolling their spaces. It's a question.
Okay.
That's okay.
No, I'm really grateful.
I don't think we'll have the final answer to that.
No, but
question. It's a pretty hypothetical.
No, but to be honest,
question.
This is what we have to be talking about. So I'm really grateful because I have to say that what you said at first, I have to respect it because it's your personal feelings. But I don't really think that people in Estonia are really worry very much whether Dali is Catalan or Spanish. So as I said, it's something that we have to respect, but it's purely personal. Yeah. So I think it's good that we start to do like the British and talk about concrete things. So let's talk about the Baltic Air Patrol. Now, first of all, if all Spain can send to the Baltics is 4 planes, I think that we have a problem. And by we mean everybody has a problem. Spain has a problem.
Okay.
No, sorry. Let me finish. Spain has a problem, Catalonia has a problem, and NATO has a problem. Because 4 planes is not really that much. So we need to increase that number. Now, I don't think that Estonians really care whether those planes are Spanish or Catalan or from wherever they are. As long as they are proper planes and they are under NATO command, I don't really think they have any particular preferences. Some people may prefer Spanish planes, others may prefer Catalan planes, but I don't really think there is a 90% majority either way. So being pragmatic, what matters is the combined capabilities and commitment, and let me stress this, because there is no point in having planes if you don't have the commitment, to support the Baltics, especially right now at this time of crisis.
Germany sent 4 planes, Great Britain 4, Spain 4, Catalonia will send 4 or 8 or 20.
Sorry.
Okay. Let's stop with the. Okay, Alex.
We can talk about other things, but not about this because it's very serious.
Okay.
No, but actually the question from the gentleman, that's a good one.
Gentlemen, order. That there is no point talking about hypothetical planes. Now, I'd want to thank, of course, all of the panelists, Albert, Diplocat, Elizabeth, the law faculty here, and of course all the participants, particularly those who asked questions and particularly those who asked challenging questions, because our aim was to have a debate. And our mission is to sort of inform Estonian people about things going on in the world, topical issues of contemporary affairs. And I think we've all learned something. There have been arguments from various approaches. And before we conclude, I'd like to hand over for the final word to Professor Mälksoo.
Yeah, I don't have much substantive to add. Kind of reconfirm what you said, and also thank everybody. I want to emphasize this, that from our point of view, this event has had a high. It had a little bit entertaining value, but I also realized that for you guys, this is very serious. This is, your places, your country's future. We won't decide that future. We listen to you. We try to understand you. I believe that we Estonians can relate to your country's problems more, or future issues more easily than some other nations, because we can always argue, what countries in the 20th century were similar and what countries were different. But some of the issues, some of the ways questions have been framed, have been similar. I go away from this talk with a strong sense that we are all in Europe. We are connected, and therefore we are more connected than what we think, than what we realize, and also that our decisions have consequences. Sometimes we don't know what these consequences will be. But finally, I'm also happy that you guys came to sort of represent the other perspective. To perhaps we should have made more effort to extend the panel in such a way. But I understand that our Spanish ambassador was today busy with a task in Amari, and couldn't make it therefore. Well, thank you, and hopefully we'll have interesting discussions like that in the future as well. Thank you for coming.
I wonder if any of these